This conflict went beyond the trenches and artillery. Its fight was not just with bayonets and barbed wire. The First World War was, in essence, a financial war, a clash fought in the gold reserves, on the bond markets, in central banks, and in the secretive offices of financiers who never saw a battlefield. While soldiers paid with their blood, bankers and governments were busy calculating balance sheets, and the decisions they made in those years not only defined the winners and losers, but also reshaped the global financial system in ways that, to this day, bind us. If you think war is all about political tactics and army movements, you need to reconsider. The Great War demonstrated that money is, indeed, a weapon, and one of the deadliest ever created. In 1914, Europe was already a powder keg ready to explode. Rivalries between nations, colonial ambitions, and military alliances had turned the continent into a dangerous game of paranoia. However, behind all the speeches about honor and empire, there was a brutal financial reality. A war on this scale was impossible to sustain without a volume of resources that defied imagination. And the truth that no one wanted to admit is this: by choosing war, the leaders were also choosing debt. Every empire that sent its troops to the front lines was simultaneously condemning its people to a future of heavy economic burdens. Despite this, in the beginning, most governments believed the war would be quick, perhaps settled by Christmas. They imagined they could finance it in the traditional way, with their gold reserves, modest loans, and patriotic donations. Within a few weeks, this mirage shattered. The conflict was consuming money at a speed no one had foreseen. To be precise, in the summer of 1914, the European financial system was still based on the gold standard. Countries guaranteed that their paper notes could be exchanged for physical gold, a mechanism that lent credibility to currencies but limited the power of governments. Gold reserves were finite. Printing money non-stop would result in the loss of public and creditor confidence. Great Britain, France, and Germany had considerable reserves, but when millions of men were called up and industrial production was redirected to the war effort, the costs skyrocketed. Germany alone was spending more than 10 million marks a day by the end of 1914, and British costs would soon reach £2.5 million a day. The math was brutal. The gold would not last. Thus, governments suspended the rules. One after another, the great powers abandoned the gold standard, silently admitting to their citizens that, from that moment on, money was a promise based solely on the faith placed in the state. And that instant, the break from the gold anchor represents one of the most significant financial transformations in modern history. It revealed the fragility of the so-called real wealth of nations. The power of money was now unshackled from metal, to be governed by printing presses, credit, and the power of persuasion. And once governments tasted this new freedom, they never looked back. The true financial war had begun. For Germany, isolated from global capital markets and surrounded by the Royal Navy, the only way out was internal debt. Berlin organized gigantic bond campaigns, appealing to patriotism and encouraging ordinary citizens to invest their savings in war loans. The propaganda was relentless, with posters of heroes and firm promises that investors would be paid back after victory. In total, Germany raised over 100 billion marks, but it was a structure built solely on hope. With defeat, these bonds became worthless. Millions of Germans saw their life savings disappear, and this deep resentment became fertile ground for the extremism that would emerge in the following decades. Economic history invariably leaves scars. In contrast, Great Britain had a fundamental advantage. The City of London was the world's financial center. The pound sterling enjoyed confidence, and British networks spanned the entire globe. Initially, the government resorted to short-term loans and patriotic appeals, but soon it tapped into the deepest sources of global credit. Most importantly, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but its bankers saw an opportunity. Companies like J.P. Morgan and Co. became the financial lifeline for Great Britain and France, brokering colossal loans and managing the purchase of weapons, food, and raw materials. By 1917, when the U.S. entered the conflict, Wall Street had already been financing the Allied cause for years. This wasn't benevolence, it was power. American bankers collected millions in commissions, and the United States emerged from the war transformed, from a debtor nation to a creditor, from a financial follower to a global leader. If you wonder how the 20th century became the American century, the answer lies here, not on the battlefields, but in the accounting books. France faced dilemmas of its own. Already weakened and in debt, it relied heavily on loans, both domestic and international. French citizens, known for their diligence in saving, were persuaded to buy government bonds, but the bulk of the financing came once again from across the Atlantic. France, just like Great Britain, became increasingly dependent on American capital, and this dependency would dictate post-war politics, with rising debts and the tension of repayment. When you study the economic crisis of the interwar period, remember that it wasn't just about reparations or the stock market. It was, crucially, about the suffocating weight of the debt accumulated during those 4 years of slaughter. Meanwhile, Russia's financial war was a disaster. The empire was vast but underdeveloped, its banking system fragile, and its gold reserves insufficient in practice. To finance the war effort, Russia resorted to heavy loans from its allies. However, with mounting defeats and soaring inflation, confidence in the ruble evaporated. By 1917, the Russian economy was in ruins, and the political system followed suit. The end of the Tsarist regime was not driven solely by ideology or ineffective generals. It was the result of a financial system pushed to its limit. Economic mistakes, monetary chaos, and inflation helped fuel the revolution. Once again, money and power walked hand in hand through history. The scale of the financial mistakes is staggering. By the end of the war, the Allied powers had spent over $140 billion, and the Central Powers around $60 billion. These were unprecedented figures, equivalent to many times the total pre-war national income of the countries involved. The result was not just a mountain of debt, but the disintegration of the old financial order. The gold standard was shattered. Inflation devoured economies. Germany would soon face hyperinflation so extreme that a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks, and the ones who paid the price were ordinary people, workers, savers, small investors. The wealthy elites, on the other hand, often protected themselves by moving assets abroad, buying real assets, and staying close to the centers of power, where privileged information arrived first. The lesson was harsh but crystal clear. In a financial war, the small investor is the first to bleed, and this is where the lesson resonates with you today. The First World War marked the moment when governments discovered they could finance the unthinkable by unhitching money from reality. They learned they could suspend the gold backing, print without limits, issue bonds to their own people, take out international loans, and later try to patch things up with propaganda and restructuring. Sound familiar? It's because that playbook was never abandoned. Every modern crisis, from the Great Depression to the 2008 global financial collapse, carries echoes of 1914, when governments or central banks insist that this is transitory, that the economic fundamentals are sound. Remember that they said the same thing in 1914, and millions believed it, until the moment the currency in their hands lost all its value. When the cannons fell silent in 1918, the world was devastated not only in the trenches but on the financial balance sheets. The United States, which had been a debtor nation before the war, now held the largest gold reserves and the largest creditor position in history. Europe, the former center of global finance, was submerged in debt. Great Britain owed more than $4 billion to the U.S., France over $3 billion, and even smaller nations were trapped by obligations they could not repay. The war elevated Wall Street to the new financial capital of the planet, dethroning London in a way that military force never could. The era of American supremacy in the realm of money and power was just beginning. But this transition was not simple. Here was the trap. When wars are financed by debt, repayment becomes a new war. Great Britain and France, desperate to honor their war bonds with their citizens, had to extract money from Germany in the form of reparations. The Treaty of Versailles demanded an astronomical sum, 132 billion gold marks, with the intent to punish and shift the burden. But this was an illusion. Germany had no way to pay. The hyperinflation of 1923, when Germans used wheelbarrows to carry worthless banknotes to buy bread, was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of a financial system pushed to its limit by impossible debts. And this sowed the anger that extremism reaped years later. Meanwhile, Great Britain tried to regain its financial prestige by returning to the gold standard in 1925, pegging the pound to its old pre-war value. This was another economic mistake of unbelievable proportions. Restoring the pound to its former parity was like trying to set a broken bone without first healing it. The result was deflation, unemployment, and instability. The policy, championed by figures like Winston Churchill, is now seen as one of the worst financial miscalculations in modern history. And once again, it was ordinary workers who paid the price. The United States, with its stockpile of gold and credit, faced a distinct challenge. American banks began to inject money into Europe, lending to Germany so it could pay reparations to Great Britain and France, which in turn would pay their debts to the US. It was a financial carousel that seemed stable at first glance, but was based on circular logic. Money was being recycled, not created. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 institutionalized this flow. And when the world economy shuddered during the Great Depression, the entire structure collapsed. The world had never been so financially interconnected and never so vulnerable. This is why the First World War transcends military history. It was a milestone in economic history, where financial illusions and mistakes shaped the future. The war proved that governments could abandon gold, inflate currencies, and borrow on an unprecedented scale, and still persuade their citizens that they were acting correctly. It demonstrated that propaganda could turn debt into patriotism, that ordinary savers could be convinced to hand over their wealth for bonds that would never be repaid, and that the true victors of the war were often those sitting in boardrooms, not those fighting in the trenches. Money and power became more tightly bound than ever before, and the world has been living with the consequences ever since. Now think about your life today. When central banks assure you that inflation is transitory, when governments raise their debt ceilings year after year, when new money is created digitally with the press of a button, remember 1914. Remember that the gold standard was abandoned out of necessity, not by chance, in a moment of desperation. Remember that the pattern of borrowing against the future, of printing to cover the present, and of selling bonds with patriotic appeals is over a century old. Every financial crisis of the modern era has its roots in those war years, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the 2008 subprime crisis. The same illusions persist, and the same people, the small saver, the middle-class worker, the modest investor, are the ones asked to make the sacrifice. The hidden financial battle behind the First World War is not a relic of the past. It is the foundation of our present. The lesson is harsh but essential. Money, when detached from real backing, becomes a tool of manipulation. Governments will always find ways to finance wars, bailouts, and crises, and they will always find ways to make you pay for it, whether through taxes, inflation, or the devaluation of your savings. True wealth does not lie merely in numbers on a screen or in the promises of politicians. Real wealth is resilience, knowledge, and the ability to discern illusions. That is the only financial freedom history grants us. And here is the final thought. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The financial playbook written in 1914 has been used time and again, disguised with new terminology, and justified by new reasons. But the final result is always the same. Those in power protect themselves, and those who lack knowledge are sacrificed. If there is one thing to be taken from this story, let it be this: never assume that money has real value just because it was printed, and never assume the system is stable just because the Authorities declare it so. The truth is always hidden in the balance sheets, and history is the only teacher that does not lie.